Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be talking about hydroponics and how it could impact the future of food, especially with climate change and all. We got this super interesting study you guys sent over from the South Asian Journal of Agricultural Sciences, and it seems like it might have a solution to a pretty big problem.
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely refreshing to see potential solutions with all the talk about climate change and how dire everything is. So this study looks at how hydroponics, that tech you see at those urban farms popping up, could actually change the game when it comes to livestock agriculture's impact on the environment.
Okay, so before we get into all the details about hydroponics, can you give us a rundown of what's happening with livestock and the environment, like in India and around the world?
Of course. So this study focuses on India, where livestock is a major part of their agricultural system. However, it brings up something a lot of countries are dealing with. India's livestock population is huge, like a massive 535.78 million, and it keeps growing. This puts a huge strain on resources, especially when it comes to having enough land for grazing and growing their feed.
Wow, over 500 million. That's a crazy number. It makes sense that it would strain resources not just in India but globally as the demand for meat goes up everywhere.
Exactly. And that leads us to fodder, the food specifically grown for livestock. The traditional ways of farming for fodder are facing a triple whammy:
Hmm.
not enough land, climate change making things unpredictable, and then there's supply chain emissions, which are often forgotten.
Okay, so less land and unpredictable weather from climate change, that's understandable. But what about the supply chain emissions?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting, and a lot of people don't realize how big of a deal it is. Did you know that according to the FAO, a whopping 35% of emissions from the global food system come from the supply chain alone? This includes everything involved in getting food to your plate, from producing and transporting fertilizers to processing, packaging, and even getting it to your local grocery store. And for livestock, a big chunk of those emissions comes from just moving fodder around, often across long distances.
35%. I had no idea it was that much.
Right.
So as more and more people want meat and dairy, those emissions from transporting feed to animals will just keep going up.
Exactly. And the study points out that this is a really big problem in India. They even suggest that India might have to start importing milk if they can't figure out how to produce enough fodder themselves. Imagine that, a country that's been a major milk producer having to rely on imports. The extra transportation alone would add a ton of emissions to that supply chain.
Okay, yeah, that does sound pretty intense. So this is where hydroponics comes in, right? Like, I know it's kind of a trendy thing these days, all these urban farms growing lettuce with LED lights, but how's it going to tackle something this big?
Right, hydroponics is definitely having its moment. But beyond the trendiness, it's a really powerful way to grow stuff, plants, without using any soil. It usually happens in these controlled environments, which is what makes it a game changer, especially for producing fodder in places like India, dealing with those issues we were just talking about.
So instead of needing huge fields of alfalfa and other feed crops, you're saying we could grow all that fodder indoors, year-round, with hydroponics.
Yeah, exactly. Think about it. You need less land. You use water way more efficiently, which is a big deal in places where water is scarce. And the best part is you can grow stuff no matter what the weather's doing outside. And here's the kicker. The study says that by keeping fodder production local with hydroponics, we could seriously cut down on those supply chain emissions we were talking about. You could grow the fodder right next to the animals so you don't have to transport it long distances.
That's a really strong argument for hydroponics, especially when we're trying to make our food systems more sustainable. Did this study actually put a number on how much of an impact hydroponics could have on those emissions?
They did. They found a study that showed a 7.4% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions when comparing hydroponic fodder production to traditional barley green farming.
Okay, I know 7.4% might not sound like a lot, but when you think about the scale of this problem, it's definitely a good place to start. Plus, the authors think we can get even bigger emission reductions as the tech improves, and we can get more fodder from the same resources. Okay, 7.4% is nothing to sneeze at, especially if you can get even better. But it almost sounds too good to be true. Are there downsides to hydroponics we should be thinking about?
You're right, gotta keep our expectations in check. It's not like hydroponics is gonna magically solve all our food problems. It's got its own challenges, just like any other tech. Probably the biggest concern is how much energy it uses. Indoor hydroponics often need artificial lights, and that can be a real energy suck.
So it's kind of a trade-off then. You reduce emissions from land use water use and all that transportation, but then you potentially increase emissions because of the energy you need. So what's the solution there?
You hit the nail on the head. It all comes down to the type of energy you're using. If you're powering your hydroponic farm with renewables like solar or wind, that changes everything. That's why it's important to look at the whole picture and think about how and where we're using this technology.
Right, so it's not just about the technology by itself, but about how we choose to use it.
Exactly. The study isn't saying that hydroponics is the answer, but it reminds us that we need innovative solutions if we want to feed everyone on this planet sustainably. And those solutions need to be adaptable to different situations.
So we shouldn't be trying to replace all traditional farming with hydroponics, right? It's more about having different tools and approaches and choosing the best one for a specific region or situation, always with sustainability in mind.
Yeah, exactly. We have to be adaptable, resourceful, and always trying to find ways to reduce how we impact the environment.
And you mentioned energy use being a big one, but what else should we be considering if we want to do hydroponics sustainably?
Yeah, the energy source is huge, for sure. We also have to think about the sustainability of the whole system. Like, what are they using to grow the plants? Are those materials renewable and environmentally friendly? And what about the waste? Hydroponic systems create nutrient runoff, so how do they dispose of that without polluting water sources? That's important.
Good points. Sounds like there's a lot of potential with hydroponics, but we need to be really thoughtful and careful about how we use it.
100%. And it's not only about the environmental impact either. We got to think about the social and economic effects too. Will it create jobs? Will regular farmers be able to use it? Or will it just be big companies who benefit? There are a lot of big questions to think about.
It's funny how the solutions that seem the most promising are often the ones that need the most careful thought, right? It's easy to get caught up in the excitement of new technology, but we have to be critical and really think about the potential impact.
I agree. And that's what I liked about this study. It talks about both the good things and the challenges of hydroponics. It's not one-sided, which is nice to see.
Speaking of looking at both sides, the study focuses mostly on India. Do you think hydroponics could be this beneficial in other parts of the world, or are there specific things about India that make it a good fit?
That's a great question. I think hydroponics has potential pretty much anywhere. It's not just for India. We're already seeing it all over the world, from deserts in the Middle East to big cities in Europe and North America. It's about figuring out the right way to use it depending on what a region needs and the problems they're facing.
So finding the right tool for the job, like you said. There's no one solution that fits everywhere, especially when it comes to sustainable food.
Exactly. Every region has its own unique situation, and hydroponics can be adapted and integrated in a way that makes sense for that specific context.
This has been super interesting, and I'm really curious to learn even more about hydroponics. But before we move on, I wanted to touch on something else the study mentioned: land sparing versus land sharing. Can you explain what those terms mean in relation to hydroponics?
Sure thing. These ideas are really important when we're talking about how we use land for food production and conservation. Land sparing basically means that we can really ramp up our agricultural production in certain areas, like with hydroponics, and that frees up land elsewhere for other uses, like wildlife habitats or reforestation.
So it's about using technology strategically to make food production more efficient in some places, which then allows us to leave other areas alone so that nature can recover.
Exactly. By concentrating our agriculture in certain areas, we can lessen our impact on the environment overall and create space for conservation.
That makes a lot of sense. What about land sharing? How is that different?
Land sharing is more about finding ways to farm sustainably within existing ecosystems rather than separating the two.
So it's about finding that balance between what humans need and what the natural world needs.
Right. It's about recognizing that we're a part of nature, not separate from it, and everything we do affects the whole ecosystem.
I like that perspective. It sounds like hydroponics could work with either approach. Land sparing, by intensifying production in certain places, or land sharing by being integrated into existing landscapes
Right.
in a way that minimizes harm.
You got it. It's all about finding that balance and choosing the approach that makes the most sense in each situation. There isn't a right answer for every situation. It all depends on the ecological and social context.
This has been a really insightful conversation. Hydroponics really seems like it could be an important part of building food systems that are sustainable and resilient, especially with climate change and a growing global population to worry about.
It definitely has the potential. And like we talked about, it's not just about the technology itself, it's about how we use it. We have to be thoughtful, focus on sustainability, and be aware of the social and economic effects too.
I totally agree. It's about finding solutions that benefit people and the planet.
Exactly. We need to create a future where everyone has enough to eat without harming our planet. That's what we should be striving for.
Wow, this deep dive has really opened my eyes to the possibilities of hydroponics. It's exciting to think about how it could change the way we grow food and tackle these huge challenges we're facing with climate change and a growing population.
What really stood out to me from this study is that it doesn't treat hydroponics like some kind of passing trend. It shows how it can be a really practical solution with the potential to make a real difference, especially when you consider the environmental impact of traditional livestock farming.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that innovation in food isn't about coming up with the fanciest gadgets. It's about finding solutions like hydroponics that are practical, can be scaled up, and can be adapted to different needs and environments.
And it's not about just swapping out one system for another either. This study really highlights the need for a balanced approach. It's about bringing different methods together, using technology in a smart way, and thinking about the social and economic impacts just as much as the environmental ones.
You've definitely given us a lot to consider. This deep dive has shown just how important it is to learn about these new solutions and be a part of conversations about the future of our food.
Exactly. The more we understand these complicated issues and explore all the options, the better prepared we'll be to create a food system that's sustainable and fair for everyone.
I couldn't agree more. Thanks so much for joining us on this deep dive into the world of hydroponics, livestock, and the future of food. For our listeners, if you want to explore this topic further, we'll be sure to include links to the study and other resources in our show notes.
It's always a pleasure to dive deep with you.
And to everyone listening, we'd love for you to think about this. What if hydroponics could help more people in areas with limited resources access fresh, nutritious food? It's something to think about. Until next time, keep those questions coming and keep diving deep.